Hey everybody, welcome out of the burn. I thought we'd do something different today. As many of you know, I have a website, deadlystaples.com. And on that, what I do is I review a lot of trade paperbacks and graphic novels. I actually read comics. I have no problem admitting that. And what I do on there is I post my reviews of what I found when I read them. I don't read books like the actual comic books because, quite frankly, it just destroys the actual comic books. Now, there are a lot of comics that I read in my youth, but I'm not actively collecting anything new anymore. So since I'm not actively collecting anything new anymore, I'm not reading any comics. So I'm generally buying or trade paperbacks and graphic novels. And what I do on my site is I review those. So every once in a while, people will ask me, Tennessee Vats, well, what are your favorite graphic novels? Well, I put some thought into this one during the whole COVID-19 mess. And I've decided I'm going to put a posting up here and I'm going to walk you guys through my top 5 of what's in my collection right now. Now, with the top 5 and that caveat of what's in my collection right now, there's a reason why I'm specifically saying that. Last year, I had well in excess of about 200 graphic novels in various shelves all throughout my house. And within those are some that were great, and there were some that I really didn't enjoy. But as I was buying them and reading them and I was posting my reviews, they just continued to accumulate. So a couple of years back, I said to myself, why do you own all these things? You don't need them anymore. Why don't you just parse this down a little? So I did. And I got rid of 99% of them. I have very few actual graphic novels still left in my collection. My personal collection right now probably consists of about, I'd say anywhere between 30 to 35 books. It's not a lot. Now within that, some things are classified as graphic novels and some aren't. But that's all that's left. So that's what I mean by what's left now. Now, I have a lot of books that I've read that I thought very highly of, but they just weren't things that I really meshed with. So those are now gone. So as I say, this is the top 5 of what's in my collection now. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start with number 5. So number 5 is The Thrilling Adventure Hour. A lot of people aren't going to know this series. A lot of people aren't even going to know what I'm referencing when I talk about this one. But The Thrilling Adventure Hour is a series of old-time radio shorts that were done by Acker and Blacker, where they put these things on, and they're still available on podcasts. You can download them. They're absolutely hilarious. I have really enjoyed listening to their audio stories. They have a bunch of series within it. They've got... there's the Socialite Ghost Hunters. There's Sparks Nevada. That's my favorite one. Sparks Nevada, the Marshal on Mars, because he's from Earth. You'd only get it if you actually listen to the podcasts. But they are really good. And what they decided to do is they decided to put out this as a one-off, where they decided to actually produce their stories. This wasn't put out as anything that was meant to be any mass-produced thing. It wasn't put out as, I guess, to be a series. But it's absolutely hilarious. The art in it is okay. The art is fairly good. But I think what really makes this stand out, and I'm going to take a shot of this with the camera later, and I'll post it up over here. What you see within it are ads, and they make these ads specific to that 1940s feel that their podcast was placed in. It's really quite good. It's quite funny. Like there's Work Juice Coffee that's constantly an ad on these things. There's a bunch of stuff. I can, Patriot brand cigarettes. That's the other Patriot brand cigarettes. I forgot about that. Yeah. Anyways, so this is, again, number 5. If you're looking for a good laugh, The Thrilling Adventure Hour. And they did produce, was it IDW that helped them produce this? Sparks Nevada himself got his own series. And that would have been probably about, I'm going to say at least 4 years ago. And there were 4 different covers on it. I had them ordered in at my local comic shop. I didn't read them, just because I wanted them to set aside so that they would go with this, because I knew I would never get rid of this. So anyways, Thrilling Adventure Hour. Quite a good one, done by Archaia. I think it's Archaia Black Label Comics. It's 1,995 cents. Really? And then it just says August. So that's not 1995. That's literally 1,995 cents. Yeah, 1995 US on the back right there. And I picked this up. I picked this up at Books A Million in Florida. I do remember buying this one, and it kept me laughing. So there you go. Number 5. Okay, let's go to number 4. Number 4. So number 4 is the only superhero title that's actually on the list, Superboy. This is a collection of the early Superboy stories. Now, there's a reason why this in particular was in my list. The cover I like here is done by Michael Cho. Boom, right right down there in the corner, you'll see the Mike Ochoa label. At least for the dust jacket, I've actually never looked at the actual book. Does the book cover? Oh, look at that. All right, let's take the dust jacket off here. There's your book cover. Series of old Superboy strips. So Superboy, for many of us who don't know, was retconned long after Superman was created. And the reason why he was retconned long afterwards was because DC Comics decided, hey, you know what, we got to make this more commutable to boys, young kids. And they ended up coming out with Superboy. What I like about this, and the reason why this is the only superhero story that's still sitting in my top 5, is the purity of these stories. Many people have heard me rant about comics in the past, have heard me talk about the issue of being dark for the sake of being dark. I don't like comics that are dark for the sake of being dark. Funny part about life is it's already dark enough. I don't need my comics to darken up my life. What I need my comics to do is lighten up my life. Thank you very much. So, ergo, when I'm looking at superhero stories, I really sort of steer clear of stories that are just exceptionally dark. Superman is my favorite comic character. Period. You can take that or leave it. I honestly don't care. The bottom line is he's my favorite. And I know why he's my favorite, because he's a comic that I read, and you can clearly see Superman is up here in the background. He's a comic that I read in my formative years. A very smart person once told me, hey, Tennessee Fats, the bottom line is the things that you like and that you connect to the most in your life are the things that you have an emotional relationship with. They're the things that were there in your formative years. This is why, for example, U2's Zooropa album, which is terrible, it ranks amongst one of my most memorable and favorite albums because it was heavily played in very formative years for me, in a very formative part of my life. Superman was there for me in my youth. This is the comic that I read when I was really young. This is the comic that spoke to me and really gave me the idea of what it meant to be a hero, what it meant to do good for the sake of good, what it meant to not stand by and do nothing when bad is being done. Those sorts of things were key messages for me. But over time, what happened is I grew up. Superman grew up. The stories grew up. The whole idea of Superman became much more intense. Superboy, however, never lost that intensity. Superboy stayed the pure form. Now, these, and I'm not going to lie to you here, are so far-fetched, they're ridiculous. There are stories in here about 8 and 10-year-olds going out and deciding to be Huckleberry Finn and creating rafts and going down river on camping trips with 4 or 5 of their friends, and their parents are fine with it. Now, I don't know anybody in their right mind that would be okay with an 8 or a 10-year-old hanging out with a bunch of other 8 or 10-year-olds and going out camping for a weekend, using guns and bows and arrows and hunting. No, but that was the market these were written to. So the purity in this is what makes this collection one of my top 5 ever. Okay, let's move on to number 3. My number 3 book is actually an odd one. Most people are actually going to have no idea what this one is. And if you don't, well, welcome to the topic. Harvey Kurtzman's The Jungle Book. This was created in 1950, I'm going to say 6. I could be wrong. You comic historians out there, you can go ahead and look this up and correct me and send me a message if I'm wrong. I believe it was 56. 58. No. 56. No, 58. Okay, there you go. You comic historians don't actually need to correct me. It was 1958. Anyways, this is my number 3. The reason why this is my number 3 is Harvey Kurtzman. Many people would recognize, you might recognize that tiny little face right there. And you might actually recognize the Kurtz if you put a little pictogram of a man here. If you did that, you would recognize this from Mad Comics. I don't know how many people read Mad magazines. I've read a lot of Mad magazines. In the formative years of my life, and I think for most other teenage boys, we had access to 1970s and 1980s Mad magazines by the bundle. They weren't worth anything, and they were just getting thrown around. And invariably, a stack of them would end up being shoved into your hands. One of the things that you always found with these, there were reprints of early 1950s Mad material. Mad was always running out of ideas. They were always running out of material to stick in the books. Mad is wonderful for admitting that it did that, and wonderful for admitting its foibles and how poorly it was thrown together at times. But the 1950s material was really when they were stretching the boundaries of what society thought was normal. They were creating the new rules of what a funny comic book meant. And some of the creators within that were really visionary. Harvey Kurtzman was one of them. So Harvey Kurtzman, by this point in time, when he wrote the Jungle Book, had separated from Mad. There was a tiff. I believe the tiff actually had to do with salary, and I believe it was an ownership fight as well. There's actually a good article at the front of this book, which actually walks through it, and it talks about how he went off and worked with Hugh Hefner of Playboy, that was a big fan of his, to create Little Annie Fanny. Now, most people are never going to admit they've read a Little Annie Fanny story. I will admit I have read a Little Annie Fanny story. The Little Annie Fanny stories are not the pure Harvey Kurtzman humor that you see, and the satirical way that he looked at things. Those, and it's actually even covered heavily in the articles at the front of this, were heavily influenced by Hugh Hefner. As much as Hugh Hefner was a huge fan of Harvey Kurtzman, he was also a real control freak for his magazine. And if you were putting something in it, boy, you better have Hugh's okay on it. So the issue there was Harvey's work got a little bit bastardized. But this book, The Jungle Book, was a book that he threw together by himself. This was self-published, and it was his chance to, when he was in a time of real financial crisis and ruin, to throw together something. This was a huge risk for him. In 1958, he covers some really funny stories in this. Each one of these is a parody. There are stories in here. There's one in here that's a parody of the movie Patterns by Rod Sterling. Anybody who's seen Patterns by Rod Sterling, it's good. Don't get me wrong. It's not what you would expect a Rod Sterling movie to be, though. It's pretty high drama, but it's a story about advertising men. Well, no, this is a story about advertising men. That's the parody. Rod Sterling's story is a story of what are they? They're the production company that does M&As. Never really got a clear sense of what that engineering company did. Weird. I guess Rod didn't really care when he was writing the movie. Anyways, but there's a parody of that in here. There's a parody of Peter Gunn in here. Thelonious Violence, I believe, is the character's name. There's a parody in here where he's talking about life in the South, because during the Second World War he was posted in the South, and he's talking about the degenerated society that's there. What's the other one that was in here? Gunsmoke. That was the other one that's in this. Absolutely hilarious satire, and I'm gonna take some shots of some of the images and I'm gonna put them up here as well. Harvey Kurtzman was a wonderful self-deprecating artist. He made fun of his own work while he was doing it, and that, I think, was one of the key strengths for any artist out there, is to be aware of their own foibles, but also, even when they know their foibles aren't foibles and they know they're genius, being honest about it. Harvey, when he was doing this was very rough work. A lot of this was done in grayscale, whitewash. None of it was color. And you'll see the work up here, and you'll see the forms. It's what I think is absolutely beautiful about this, and the reason why this maintains in my top 5 is when you're looking at the art, everything is just basic geometric shapes. Especially his use of women, especially in that Southern Belle story. Was it Decadence? Decadence Degenerated is what the actual name of the story is. And in that, there's a bunch of guys that are literally ogling a woman who's walking by. And in their mind, there's a thought bubble here where she's walking by completely buck naked. But when you look at that image, you clearly see this is nothing but a series of geometric shapes. And it's beautiful the way that Harvey puts this stuff together, blends it, and then you've got that. I wish I could do stuff like that. I know I can't, and I probably never will be able to. But genius nonetheless. And that's why this one sits in my top 5. Okay, so now we're on to number 2. So number 2 for me is actually a tie. And it's cheating. I don't care. It's my channel. It's a tie here. And for me, number 2 is Wally Wood. And I know there's a lot of people out here who are comic historians who are going to tell me, no, Wally Wood didn't like being called Wally Wood. He liked being called Wallace Wood. Well, Wallace, or Wally, because I think most people call him Wally, did genius work. His art, just, it's bar none mind-blowing. For the era when he was creating it, there was nobody in the same rank, in the same field. Wally Wood, even though he was coexisting at the same time as Kirby and Ditko and a bunch of other people, it's in my mind that he is probably the most prolific, ingenious writer-creator of a non-comic or a non-superhero medium. You got Jack Kirby, hands down, done. Absolute best superhero writer, artist, period. I'm never going to argue with that. Wallace Wood, however, is hands down the greatest comic artist and writer. in the 1950s and 60s that did things that weren't necessarily always superhero stories. He did the horror stuff. He did the suspense stuff. He did the cops and robbers stuff. He did the real core gritty stuff. Now, you just heard me say, hey, I don't like things that are gritty for the sake of being gritty. I will give Wallace Wood a pass. And Wallace gets a pass because he was being gritty and introducing the idea of grittiness to comics when it was necessary. The whitewash Americana panacea vision was failing. Hippies were blossoming all over the place. The counterculture that really destroyed much of what society was in the 1950s was spreading. And Wallace was reflecting that in his work. So for me, I'm going to give him a tie here. And it comes down to two things. My tie is between Canon, which is a collection of the strips that were, I believe, produced. It was a military man. Was it Stars and Stripes? Couldn't have been Stars and Stripes. You comic historians can correct me on that one. I can't remember. I believe it's Stars and Stripes reprints, but this is phenomenally good. And the second one that I'm going to tie this one, another Wallace Wood, called Came the Dawn. This is a collection of the suspense stories that he did for EC. And there is one story in this book that, in my mind, is possibly the single greatest critique of Americana and the failings of Americana, especially with all the racial tension that was growing at the time. It's in here, and it just, every time I read that, I put the book down, and I literally have to just digest for about a minute. I'm not going to tell you which one it is. You buy the book, and you read it your damn self, because it's worth it. It is entirely worth it. This one, however, is tied with Canon, because this is just over the top. Every single page in this has him with his shirt off, punching commies, and sleeping with someone. This was just pure, it was like holding a mirror up to what Wallace Wood, I'm sure, thought 007 movies were. This is just phenomenal. The guy is brainwashed. He's counter-brainwashed. They use him as a sleeper agent. He's fighting the communists. He's fighting communists in America as well as outside of America. But the art in here is so pure because it's all black and white. There's no color to this. This is simply black ink on white paper. That's it. I have never seen somebody communicate an image better with black ink and white paper than Wallace Wood. And between the story that's written in this one and the just phenomenal art and tension that screams in this one, that's why these two are tied for my number 2 spot. Okay, now we're down to number 1. Number 1. This is the one that people have been waiting for. Number 1 graphic novel of Tennessee fans. Again, it's a tie. And honestly, I don't care if you're upset with it. That's just what it is. These are 2 books created by Seth. Some of our American friends will have heard of Seth. Some of our Canadian comic, especially underground comic fans, definitely know Seth. Seth is the pen name, and I believe it might even be his legal name now. I don't know. Who am I to gauge? Of Gregory Gallant. I don't know. Listen, there's all sorts of ways that you could pronounce that. It doesn't matter. Seth. Seth is his name. And Seth has been producing comics that I've been reading since the early 1990s. He started off with a title called, or at least that I was introduced with. He may have done work before that, but you know, I'm not looking into it. I'm just fascinated with what I got. There was a title called Palookaville. Palookaville was produced by Drawn and Quarterly, which is a publishing house out of Montreal. And in that, what Seth did was these beautiful self-deprecating stories about his youth, his formative years, and what he did and how he moved through the 1980s into what he is now. And it's incredible because I've never read anything by an artist that's more pure in their view of themselves and how they produce themselves as I've seen in Palookaville and work done by Seth. His art, as you've heard my comment I just made about Wallace Wood. You heard that with regards to the beauty of how he can communicate something with nothing but black ink on white paper. Seth has become a genius in doing the exact same thing. His work is that. It's exactly that. It's a black ink on white paper. I'm sure there's a lot of things that people are going to find where they're going to say, oh, well, this has been brushed and what have you. The guy's a prolific creator. He's very artistic. He's even made a small town of Dominion, an actual model town of it. And I wish I actually knew about it at the time to go and see this in the museum when it was presented, because I missed it. But these are the sorts of things that he's done. And although the Palookaville stuff, in my mind, is genius, I love it. And quite frankly put, one of my favorite books is actually Bannock and Black Beans, which is his story he co-wrote with his father before his father passed away. There are parts of that book where literally I wept a tear. I was like, oh, damn. The issue was the fact that his father remembers a sibling as an infant, a baby, dying in the night. But his father is so blemished by the youth and the experience that he had, is he doesn't even remember the name of that toddler. That just, my brain exploding. That's the kind of beauty you see in the work that's done by Seth. But my favorite book, and this is the number one, and these are tied, because really in my mind, these two books are one book, is Wimbledon Green, The Greatest Comic Book Collector in the World. This is entirely satirical. It is hilarious. This really, as a Toronto comic book collector, this just screams basically Toronto and Ontario comic collecting. It's a whole story about this perfect world that Seth has created of comic collectors. And Wimbledon Green is this ideologicalized idea of this overweight former comic dealer that in the 70s, after his mother died, broke down and drove back and forth across the country several times collecting books, and then found the Something Web collection, which is a massive collection of all mint condition Golden Age comics, and how he gets himself into this world of conspiracy, and he's competing with other rich comic collectors. And one of the guys that he's competing with, for example, has a private car that he hooks onto the backs of trains when he has to go places, because they're comic collectors. At one point in time, Wimbledon Green loses his memory, and his manservant, who's also his helicopter pilot and driver, yes, he has a helicopter pilot, is looking for him and is following the trail and goes to a diner and says, "Hey, have you seen this guy?" The guy behind the diner says, yeah, I seen him. He left him by about an hour. He's that way. And then he stops the manservant and says, "Well, why are you looking for this guy?" And he stops and he says, turns around and just completely deadpan, just says, "Because he's the greatest comic collector in the world." And the other guy's like, "Oh, all right, whatever." And he goes back to washing the dishes. It's beautiful the way this works. This and it's the art. And I'm going to take some shots here. I'll put it up here, just panning across the pages. Like, it's just gorgeous art, and it's all done in this beautiful, almost sepia tone-esque 1940s style design. And this book, I think I've now read this at least 10 times. And it's this that just makes me chuckle every time, because every time I find this, I find something else in it. But this is mirrored with this, which is, I think this was a sequel to this. And I think this was just a collection of short stories that were then thrown together. And it's called The Great Northern Brotherhood of Canadian Cartoonists. And what it is it talks about a bunch of the people within here. And there are actual, if you watch, you're very careful, you'll see that there are people that are referenced in here that are also referenced in here. These are in the same world or universe. It's all this beautiful interwoven story. And this talks about this ideological world, again, of cartoonists, Canadian cartoonists, how they were famous, and they had parades, and they have a Mountie at the door of their lodge, which they later admit that he made up. But they have an archive up in northern Canada. You have to can only go there at a certain time of the year. If you go in the winter, you have to check into a room because you have to take a bus. It's going to get snowed in. It's absolutely beautiful. And what I love about these is just the pure simplicity of the stories. It's such a shock reading these as compared to his other work in Palookaville and in Clyde Fans. I will admit I have met Seth. I met him when he was touring after he produced Clyde Fans, and I watched a one-man performance, and he did a sketch in the front of the book that I bought when I was there, and I had a great time. Very, what would I say? What would be the word I would use? Just a personable and nice fella. That's all I can say. But it's interesting. This brooding, archaic sort of artistic side of him doesn't come out when you're sitting in front of him, but it comes out in his work. And then to have these sort of whimsical stories pop up, these, again, give me hope that, there are lighter stories that can be written for comics. And that's why this one ranks as my absolute number one right now for graphic novels. In my opinion, those should be one book. But you know what? Hey, listen, I'm not here. There's a reason why there are 2 books, and I'm sure Seth knows it. And maybe one day, if he ever watches this, maybe he'll pick up the phone and call me and say, hey, Tennessee Fats, you're an idiot. This is why. Sorry. But anyways, that's it. That's my number 1. So everybody, this is a different video for me. I hope you enjoyed this one. This was literally a response to a question that was asked of me. And if you ask other questions of me, you're going to get different answers. It's like if somebody said to me, hey, Tennessee Fats, what's your favorite superhero collection of trade paperbacks? It's going to be entirely different. This is still going to rank probably in that, and I'd probably say it's my number 1, even though it is a hardcover and not a trade paperback. But I cheat sometimes in these definitions. You're going to find some other weird things in there as well. And I'm pretty sure one of them is a book that doesn't even exist. But I know someday somebody will make it. And if they do, I hope it's in my lifetime. So I'm going to stick with this and this whole comic motif on the channel. And there's a reason why I stick with this on the channel. And this is, quite frankly, me explaining to you what you're seeing on the channel. You're getting this stuff because this is what's of interest to me. As much as this is a hobby of mine that I go to and I walk away from and take breaks from and then I come back to, this is literally the thing that I continue to come back to as my hobby, as my interest in the house and even outside of the house. So this is what you're going to see here. Every once in a while, you'll see me out doing something odd, some random adventure of some sort. But as far as the core playlist goes, it's comics. So if you like this sort of content and you like seeing me rant about this stuff, by all means, like the video, subscribe to the channel. And I hope to see you in the next one.